"Don't embarrass me tonight," my wife said, adjusting my tie like she was fixing a problem instead of a person, her voice low enough that no one else in the room could hear it but sharp enough to stay with me long after she walked away, and I remember nodding, calm, almost obedient, because that's what she expected, that's what everyone expected, the quiet husband who showed up, smiled politely, and stayed out of the way while she owned every room she entered. And for a long time I played that role well, maybe too well, because somewhere along the line people stopped seeing me as anything else, just an accessory to her success, a background detail in a life that looked perfect from the outside, and standing there in the mirror of our downtown condo, watching her smooth down the front of her emerald dress, I realized something had shifted, not in her, but in me, something quiet and final. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise but changes everything that comes after, and she didn't notice it. Of course she didn't. She was already checking her phone, already halfway into the night before it even began, her reflection bright, confident, untouchable, while mine stood just behind her, steady, unreadable, and I remember thinking how strange it was that two people could stand inches apart and live in completely different worlds, hers built on appearances and applause. Mine built on things she never bothered to ask about anymore, things she assumed didn't matter, because if they did, surely she would have noticed, right, but she didn't, and that was the point, wasn't it? The silence, the assumptions, the way she could look at me and see only what she wanted to see, and I let her, for years I let her, because it was easier that way, easier than correcting the story she told herself and everyone else, easier than explaining the parts of my life that didn't fit into her version of success. And maybe I told myself it didn't matter, that marriage wasn't about keeping score, that showing up quietly still counted, but nights like this had a way of exposing cracks you didn't want to look at too closely, and as we stepped into the elevator, the soft hum filling the space between us, I caught her glance in the mirrored wall, the quick once-over, the subtle tension in her jaw, like she was bracing for something I hadn't done yet, and that's when I understood, it wasn't about me embarrassing her, not really, it was about control, about making sure I stayed exactly where she needed me to be, predictable, harmless, forgettable, and I almost smiled at that, not out of anger, not even out of resentment, but because for the first time in a long time, I knew something she didn't, something that would matter before the night was over, and as the elevator doors opened to the lobby, lights spilling in, voices echoing from the street outside, she stepped forward without waiting, heels clicking against marble like a countdown I could finally hear, and I followed a step behind, just like always, except this time there was a difference, a quiet one, the kind no one notices until it's too late. And if you had seen us then, walking out into the night, you would have thought it was just another corporate gala, another polished evening of drinks and laughter and people pretending to be exactly who they wanted the world to believe they were. And maybe that's what it was for them, but for me, it was something else entirely, something already set in motion long before she told me not to embarrass her, something that had been building in silence, piece by piece, until all that was left was the moment to let it unfold. And as we approached the entrance, valet lights reflecting off black cars lined up along the curb, I slipped my hands into my pockets, feeling the familiar weight of something I had carried for a long time without ever needing to use it, not until tonight, and I remember thinking, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a kind of calm clarity I hadn't felt in years, that she was right about one thing, I wouldn't embarrass her tonight, not the way she expected, not the way she feared, but in a way she would never see coming, and by the time she realized what had changed, the night would already be rewritten. The ballroom at the Waldorf shimmered like something out of a magazine spread, all glass and gold and quiet money, the kind of place where every laugh was measured and every handshake meant something, and the moment we stepped inside, Olivia changed, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but enough, her posture straightened, her smile sharpened, her voice lifted half a tone higher as she greeted people by name, executives, directors, the kind of crowd that spoke in numbers and deals instead of small talk, and I followed just behind her. The same place I had occupied for years, close enough to be seen, far enough to be dismissed, and it did not take long before the pattern started, it never did, a glance here, a subtle pause there, The way conversations would shift when I joined them, like I had interrupted something more important without meaning to, and Olivia handled it effortlessly, introducing me with that same polished smile. "This is Daniel, my husband." Nothing more, no context, no explanation, just a label that seemed to shrink the space around me, and I would nod, shake hands, play my part, because that was the expectation, and expectations, once set, are hard to break, especially when everyone benefits from keeping them intact. And as the night unfolded, I noticed the details I used to ignore, the way her colleagues spoke over me instead of to me, the way they directed every meaningful question back to her, the way their eyes flickered with polite disinterest when I answered anything beyond yes or no. And maybe it had always been like this, maybe I had just chosen not to see it, but tonight it felt clearer, sharper, like someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I had been looking through for years. And then there was Ethan Blake, standing near the center of it all, confident in that effortless way that comes from knowing you belong, his suit perfectly tailored, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without demanding it, and when Olivia saw him, something in her expression shifted again. Not something obvious, not something anyone could call out, but something I recognized instantly, because I had seen it before, that slight lift in her eyes, that ease in her posture, like she had stepped into a version of herself she preferred, and he greeted her. Like they shared a private understanding, a familiarity that went beyond simple coworkers, his hand lingering just a second longer than necessary, her laugh coming just a fraction too quick, and I watched it all without reacting, without stepping in, because reactions reveal more than silence ever does, and silence, I had learned, was a powerful thing when used correctly. And as the drinks were poured and the conversations deepened, the distance between us became more than physical, it became something structural, like we were part of the same scene but not the same story, and at one point, as we stood with a small group near the bar, someone asked Olivia about the upcoming announcement, something about leadership changes, about the future of the company, and she handled it with that same confident rhythm, speaking in just enough detail to sound informed without giving anything away. And when the question turned to me, unexpected but inevitable, Ethan was the one who asked it. Casual, almost friendly. "So Daniel, what is it that you do?" And there it was, not an insult, not on the surface, just a question, but one that carried weight in a room like this, because in a place where everyone defined themselves by their position, not having a clear answer was the same as having none at all, and I could feel the subtle shift in attention. The way conversations paused just enough to listen, the way Olivia's smile tightened at the edges, like she was bracing for something she had already decided would disappoint her, and for a moment, I let the silence sit there, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, because timing, like everything else tonight, mattered more than the words themselves, and as I looked at Ethan, then at Olivia, then back at the room that had already made up its mind about me, I realized something simple and undeniable. They were all waiting for me to confirm the story they believed, the one where I was exactly what she had implied, nothing more, nothing unexpected, nothing worth remembering, and I almost gave it to them, almost smiled and brushed it off the way I always had, but instead I did something different, something small, something barely noticeable. I took a slow sip of my drink, set the glass down carefully, and met his eyes with a calm that did not match the situation, not yet, and said, "I do a few things." My voice even, unhurried, giving them nothing and everything at the same time, and the moment passed, just like that, the conversation moving on, the attention shifting away, but something had changed, not in the room, not yet, but in the direction the night was heading, because from that point on, every glance, every laugh, every assumption they made was no longer just part of the background, it was part of something building, something they could not see, something that would not stay hidden for much longer. And as Olivia leaned in toward Ethan, her voice low, her smile easy, completely unaware of what was coming, I realized the night had already started rewriting itself, they just had not reached the part where they understood it. The music shifted slightly as the evening moved deeper into itself, a softer tempo undercut by the low hum of conversations that carried across the room like overlapping currents, and I stayed where I was, just outside the center of attention, watching the way Olivia leaned into the rhythm of it all, her voice blending seamlessly with the people who mattered here, the ones who shaped decisions and signed off on futures. And Ethan remained close to her side, not in a way that would raise questions on its own, but in a way that made everything else around them feel secondary, like they were already aligned in something the rest of the room had not fully caught up to yet. And I noticed the small things, the kind of details you only pick up when you stop trying to belong, the way he would angle his body toward her when she spoke, the way she would glance at him before finishing a sentence, as if confirming something silently. Something practiced, and I let that realization settle. Without reacting, because reactions would have been premature, and tonight was not about impulse, it was about timing, and timing requires patience, the kind you build over years without even realizing it. And as a server passed by with a tray of drinks, I took another glass without really tasting it, more out of habit than anything else, my attention fixed on the stage being set in front of me, because that is what it was, not just a gathering, not just a celebration, but a stage, and everyone here had a role they were already committed to playing, even if they did not know how the script ended. And then the announcement began to take shape, subtle at first, hinted at in conversations that grew just loud enough to be overheard, phrases like transition, leadership, next phase, the kind of language that sounds neutral but carries weight, and I saw the way people began to shift their positions in the room, gravitating toward the front, toward the space where the main event would unfold, and Olivia moved with them, naturally, confidently, as if she already knew where she belonged, and Ethan followed just half a step behind, his expression calm, assured, like a man who had already rehearsed what was coming. And for a moment, as they stood together near the front, framed by the soft lighting and the attention of the room, they looked exactly like what everyone expected them to be, the future, the next step, the obvious choice. And that was when the first real crack appeared, not in them, but in the story they thought they were telling, because I had seen that look before, not just tonight, but weeks ago, in a different setting, a quieter one, when I was not supposed to be paying attention. When a late night and an unanswered call led me to notice patterns I had ignored for too long, and once you notice a pattern, it is impossible to unsee it. The late meetings that ran just a little too long, the messages that arrived just after midnight, the way her explanations became just vague enough to sound complete without actually saying anything, and I did not confront it, not then, because confrontation is loud and messy and easy to dismiss, and I was not interested in easy. I was interested in certainty, in understanding the full shape of what I was dealing with before making a single move, and that is when everything began to align, not all at once, but piece by piece, a detail here, a confirmation there, until the picture became clear enough that there was no room left for doubt, and standing there now, watching them prepare for what they believed was their moment, I realized how confident they had become in that picture, how certain they were that no one else could see it, how comfortable they were building something in plain sight. And there is a kind of confidence that comes from thinking you are ahead of everyone else, a kind of ease that makes you careless, not in obvious ways, but in small, almost invisible ones, the kind that only matter if someone is looking closely enough to catch them, and I had been looking, longer than they knew, longer than they would ever guess, and as the room quieted slightly, attention drawing toward the stage where a microphone had just been adjusted, I felt that same calm settle in again, steady, controlled, because this was the part where everything began to move from preparation to execution. And they still believed they were in control of the narrative, that this night belonged to them, that every step had been planned in their favor, and maybe it had been, at least from their perspective, but perspectives have limits, and theirs did not include me, not in any meaningful way, not anymore, and that was the advantage, the one thing they had underestimated completely. And as Olivia smoothed her dress and exchanged a quick glance with Ethan, something unspoken passing between them, I realized they were ready. Ready for their version of the night to unfold, ready for the moment they thought would define what came next, and I almost felt a sense of appreciation for how perfectly they had set it up, how cleanly they had positioned themselves, because it meant I did not have to do much to change the outcome, just enough to shift the direction. Just enough to let the truth surface at the exact moment it would matter most, and as the first words of the official announcement began to echo through the room, measured and confident, I took a small step forward, not into the spotlight yet, But closer than before, close enough that when the time came, I would not have to move far at all, and in that moment, surrounded by people who believed they understood everything happening around them, I knew something they did not, something that would change the tone of every word spoken after this, because the story they were about to celebrate was not the one that would be remembered by the end of the night. The voice at the microphone carried clean and confident across the ballroom, the kind of practice tone that made even routine announcements feel important, and people leaned in just slightly, glasses pausing midair, conversations fading into a polite silence that signaled attention rather than curiosity. And I watched as the senior partner on stage began outlining the company's next chapter, words like growth, expansion, leadership, continuity filling the space with the familiar rhythm of corporate reassurance. And Olivia stood near the front with Ethan just off her shoulder, both of them composed, both of them already positioned like they belonged in the future being described. And as the speech continued, I noticed how often her eyes flicked toward him, not nervously, not even consciously, but with a kind of quiet alignment, as if each sentence spoken up there was confirming something they had already discussed, already planned, and it would have been easy to miss if you were not looking for it, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it, the small synchronization between two people who believe they are moving in step toward the same outcome, and I felt that same steady calm settle deeper in my chest, not rising, not reactive, just present, because this was the part where most people would feel something sharp, anger or betrayal or the urge to interrupt what was unfolding, but none of that came, not anymore. Because those reactions belong to moments when you are still trying to change what is happening, and I was not trying to change it, I was letting it happen exactly as they expected, because that was the only way it would land the way it needed to, and as the speaker paused to acknowledge the leadership team, inviting a few names forward, the energy in the room shifted again, anticipation building in a subtle but undeniable way, and Ethan straightened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal readiness, and Olivia mirrored that shift, her posture tightening with the kind of controlled excitement that comes from being on the edge of something significant, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of her I used to know, the one who chased opportunity with both hands, who believed in building something together, who used to look at me the way she now looked at the stage, and it passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by the polished composure she wore so well in rooms like this, and I realized how far that distance had grown, not overnight, not from a single decision, but from a series of small shifts that neither of us had fully acknowledged until it became too wide to ignore, and standing there, just behind the line of attention, I thought about the first time I noticed something was off, not a dramatic moment, not a confrontation, but a quiet inconsistency, a detail that did not quite fit, and how I had dismissed it at the time, telling myself it was nothing, that relationships change, that people evolve, and that not every question needs an answer, but questions have a way of returning, especially when the answers start to matter, and over time, those small inconsistencies formed a pattern, one that became harder to explain away, until explanation was no longer an option, only acceptance, and once you accept something fully, without trying to reshape it into something more comfortable, it gives you clarity, the kind that strips away hesitation and replaces it with direction, and that is where I had been for a while now, moving quietly, observing, confirming, preparing, not out of spite, not even out of revenge, but out of a need to understand exactly where I stood before taking a single step forward, and as the speaker on stage began to transition toward the main announcement, the room tightening around that moment, I felt the final pieces of that preparation settle into place. Not with excitement, not with tension, but with a simple certainty that everything was aligned the way it needed to be, and Olivia glanced back once, just for a second, her eyes finding mine across the space, and there was something there, not recognition, not concern, just a brief check, like she was making sure I was still where she expected me to be, still playing the part she had assigned me, and I met her gaze without changing anything, no expression, no signal, just the same calm presence she had already categorized, and she turned back toward the stage, satisfied, unaware that the version of me she believed in was already gone, replaced by something she had never taken the time to understand. And as the final introduction was made, as the moment they had been waiting for began to take shape in front of everyone, I realized how complete their confidence was, how certain they were that the night would unfold exactly as planned, and that certainty, more than anything else, was what made what came next inevitable, because the higher the expectation, the sharper the shift when reality does not follow it, and I did not need to raise my voice or interrupt or draw attention to myself to change that. I just needed to be ready at the exact moment when their version of the story reached its peak, because that is when it would break the cleanest, and as the applause started to build, signaling the transition into what everyone believed would be a defining moment, I took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough that when the time came, I would not be watching from the edge anymore. I would be part of it, whether they were ready for that or not. There is a moment in every room like this where the truth exists just beneath the surface, not hidden, not even particularly protected, just waiting for someone to recognize it for what it is. And as the applause settled into a steady rhythm, I realized that moment had already passed for me long before tonight ever began, because what they were celebrating now, what they believed was unfolding naturally, had been set into motion weeks earlier in a place far less impressive than this ballroom. Under lighting that did not flatter anyone, in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, where decisions were made without ceremony and without an audience, and I remember sitting at the far end of that table, listening as numbers were discussed, projections laid out, the usual language of growth and strategy, and Ethan was there, confident even then, presenting ideas that sounded polished, forward-thinking, exactly the kind of direction people in that room wanted to hear, and Olivia sat beside him, not across, not separate, but beside, her agreement coming in subtle nods and reinforcing comments that aligned perfectly with everything he said, and at the time, no one questioned it. Why would they? It looked like collaboration, like teamwork, like the natural alignment of two people working toward the same goal, and I said nothing, because silence in a room like that carries more weight than interruption, and I had learned to let people reveal themselves without needing to push them, and it was not just what they said, it was what they assumed, the way they spoke about ownership as if it were already settled, the way decisions were framed as if certain approvals were guaranteed. And that is when the first real clarity settled in, not emotional, not reactive, just factual, because assumptions like that do not come from nowhere. They come from conversations that happen when you believe no one important is listening, and I realized then that they had built something, not just between them, but around them, a version of the future that excluded variables they had decided no longer mattered, and I understood exactly what variable I had become in their equation, something fixed, something predictable, something that would not interfere, and for a while, I let that assumption stand, because there is value in being underestimated, a quiet advantage that grows stronger the longer it goes unchallenged, and instead of correcting them, instead of stepping in and reshaping their expectations, I stepped back, just enough to observe how far they would take it, how comfortable they would become operating within that version of reality, and comfort, as it turns out, is where people make their most revealing mistakes, not dramatic ones, not obvious ones, but small confirmations that reinforce everything they believe is already secure. The late-night messages that shifted from cautious to casual, the meetings that no longer needed explanations, the language that moved from possibility to certainty, and each of those details added another piece to a picture that was already becoming impossible to ignore, and I did not confront Olivia about it, not directly, because confrontation invites denial, and denial muddies clarity, and I had no interest in muddying anything. I wanted it clean, undeniable, structured in a way that did not rely on interpretation or emotion, and that is when preparation began, not loudly, not in a way anyone would notice, but methodically, the way you approach something that requires precision more than speed. Conversations with legal that were framed as routine, reviews of documents that no one questioned because they had been part of my role long before any of this started, adjustments that looked like maintenance but were actually positioning, and all of it done without urgency, because urgency draws attention. And attention would have changed the way they moved, and I needed them to keep moving. Exactly as they were, confident, unguarded, certain that the path ahead was theirs to walk without interruption, and standing here now, watching that path reach what they believed was its destination, I could see how complete their confidence had become, how fully they had committed to the outcome they expected, and there is a kind of inevitability that comes with that level of certainty. A sense that nothing can disrupt it because nothing has so far, and that is exactly when disruption is most effective, not when people are cautious, not when they are questioning, but when they are convinced. And as the final words of the introduction gave way to the next phase of the evening, the one they had been anticipating, I felt no urgency to act, no need to rush into the moment, because everything that mattered had already been set into place long before this night began, and all that remained was timing. The simple act of stepping into a space they believed was already defined, and allowing the truth they had overlooked to surface in a way that could not be ignored. And as Olivia stood there, composed, confident, unaware of how much of her certainty was built on something that no longer existed, I realized that the version of this story she believed in had already ended. She just had not reached that part yet. By the time the applause faded into polite conversation again, the room had already shifted into its next phase, the one where outcomes begin to solidify and people start aligning themselves with whatever they believe is about to rise. And I watched as Ethan stepped forward just slightly, not onto the stage yet, but close enough that his presence was no longer passive. Close enough that the people around him began to treat him differently, with a kind of anticipatory respect that only shows up when someone is expected to move upward. And Olivia remained at his side, her posture relaxed but precise, her expression carrying that quiet confidence that comes from believing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And I noticed how natural it all looked, how effortless their positioning had become, as if this moment was not just planned but inevitable, and that was the part that made everything easier. Because inevitability creates blind spots, and blind spots are where plans either fail or succeed completely. And I let my gaze move across the room, taking in the details one last time, the executives clustered in familiar groups, the board members standing just far enough apart to observe rather than participate, the assistants and coordinators moving quietly along the edges, all of them playing roles they understood without needing direction, and in the middle of it all, the assumption remained intact. The belief that the structure of this company, of this moment, was already decided, already stable, already moving forward without interruption, and I almost appreciated how cleanly they had built that assumption, how consistent they had been in reinforcing it, because consistency creates confidence, and confidence lowers defenses, and lowered defenses make timing everything. And I checked my watch out of habit, not because I needed to, but because it marked a point in the sequence I had already mapped out, a quiet confirmation that everything was unfolding exactly as expected. And I remembered the last conversation I had before tonight, not with Olivia, not with Ethan, but with someone who understood the structure beneath all of this, someone who did not care about appearances or assumptions, only about what was documented, what was binding, what could not be reinterpreted once revealed. And that conversation had been short, direct, the kind that does not require explanation because both sides already understand the stakes. And when it ended, there had been no drama, no tension, just a simple acknowledgement that when the time came, the structure would hold. And standing here now, I felt that same certainty settle in again, not as a feeling, but as a fact, something already decided long before anyone in this room believed they were making decisions tonight. And as the host returned to the microphone to guide the evening toward its central announcement, I saw the final alignment take place, the way people shifted their attention forward. The way Ethan adjusted his stance just enough to signal readiness, the way Olivia's expression softened into something almost proud, like she was already stepping into a future she had claimed for herself, and I realized that this was the exact point I had been waiting for, not earlier, not later, but right here, where expectation reached its peak and certainty became visible to everyone watching, because that is when the contrast would land the hardest. When the difference between what was believed and what was real would no longer be subtle. And I did not rush forward, did not interrupt, did not draw attention prematurely, because control is not about being first, it is about being precise, and precision requires patience even when everything inside the moment is pushing toward action. And instead, I let the sequence continue, let the introduction build, let the host begin outlining the transition that everyone assumed was already approved, already finalized, already inevitable. And I watched as Ethan took a breath, small but deliberate, preparing to step into a role he believed was already his. And Olivia turned slightly toward him, her expression carrying a quiet reassurance, a shared understanding that everything they had worked toward was about to become real in the eyes of everyone in the room, and for a brief second, I wondered if she would look back again, if something instinctive would make her check, but she did not, because there was no reason for her to, not in the version of reality she believed in, and that absence of doubt, that complete trust in the outcome, was what made the next step unavoidable. And as the host began to call forward the individuals who would define the company's next chapter, I took one final breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the transition from observation to action, because everything up to this point had been preparation, positioning, allowing the night to unfold exactly as they expected, and now, for the first time, it was about to move in a direction they had not accounted for, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the same quiet certainty they had relied on, only this time it would not work in their favor. And as Ethan shifted his weight forward, ready to step into the spotlight, I moved as well, just enough to ensure that when the moment arrived, I would not be standing behind the line anymore. I would be standing directly in it, and when the truth surfaced, it would not feel like an interruption, it would feel like the natural continuation of a story they thought they had already finished writing. The host's voice carried a slight lift now, the kind that signals a transition from introduction to declaration, and the room responded the way it always does in moments like this, subtle shifts forward, glasses lowered, conversations cut mid-sentence as attention narrowed toward the stage, and I watched as Ethan took that half-step that placed him just within the edge of the spotlight, not fully in it yet, but close enough that the intention was clear, and Olivia stood just behind him, her expression composed, her confidence unshaken, the quiet certainty of someone who believes she is witnessing the culmination of something carefully built, and for a second, everything aligned exactly the way they expected it to, the lighting, the timing, the narrative, all of it moving toward a single, predictable outcome, and then something small changed, not in the room, not in the speech, but in the sequence itself, because as the host began to name the individuals stepping into new leadership roles, my name came first, not announced with emphasis, not dramatized, just stated plainly, like a fact that had always been there whether anyone acknowledged it or not, and there was a brief pause, the kind that happens when reality does not match expectation, a fraction of a second where people process before reacting. And I stepped forward into that pause without hesitation, not rushing, not forcing attention, just moving with the same calm rhythm I had carried all night, and I could feel the shift ripple outward, confusion first, then recognition, then something closer to recalibration as people adjusted their understanding of what they were seeing, and Ethan did not move immediately, his posture holding just long enough to betray the moment of uncertainty before he stepped back slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create space, and Olivia's expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could call out from across the room, but I saw it clearly, the tightening around her eyes, the brief flicker of something that had not been there before, something that did not belong to confidence or control, and I reached the stage as the host continued, now outlining responsibilities, authority, structure, words that carried more weight with each sentence, because they were no longer abstract. They were attached to a name that had just disrupted the narrative everyone thought they understood, and I did not take the microphone immediately. I let the moment settle, let the room catch up to itself, because silence, when used correctly, forces attention in a way volume never can, and when I finally looked out across the room, I did not search for reactions, I did not need to, I already knew what they would be: surprise, confusion, recalculation. The quiet reshuffling of assumptions happening in real time, and my voice, when I spoke, came out exactly the way I intended, steady even, without urgency or emotion. I appreciate everyone being here tonight. Simple words, nothing revealing yet, nothing confrontational, just enough to anchor the moment in something that felt controlled, deliberate, and I could feel the room settle again, not because they understood, but because they were trying to fit this version of me into the framework they had already built. And that is when I let the next piece fall into place, not as a revelation, not as an accusation, but as a clarification, the kind that removes doubt without raising questions. There have been a lot of assumptions about how this transition would unfold. I said, my gaze moving across the room without lingering on any one person. And tonight seemed like the right time to make sure those assumptions align with the actual structure of the company. And there it was, not a confrontation, not yet, but a shift, a line drawn between perception and reality that could not be ignored once it had been acknowledged. And I saw the reaction ripple again, subtle but unmistakable, conversations that had not yet started now forming in people's minds, connections being made, details being reconsidered, and for the first time, the certainty that had filled the room at the start of the evening began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be reversed, and I did not need to raise my voice or escalate the moment to feel it. This shift was already happening, already taking hold, and as I turned slightly, just enough to bring Ethan and Olivia into my line of sight without making them the center of attention, I realized that the version of the night they had been preparing for was no longer available to them, not because it had been taken away, but because it had never truly existed the way they believed, and now, standing in front of a room that was beginning to understand that difference, I knew the next step would not feel like an interruption, it would feel like a correction, one that had been waiting for the right moment to surface, and that moment had finally arrived. The room did not erupt, it did not break into chaos or noise, it tightened, like a structure under pressure that had not yet decided where it would give, and that tension was more powerful than any reaction, because it meant people were listening differently now, not casually, not politely, but with intent, and I let that tension hold for a moment before continuing, not rushing to fill it, because the space between words was doing as much work as the words themselves. There is a difference, I said, my voice steady, measured, between what is discussed in meetings and what is actually binding. And I could see it land, not fully understood yet, but recognized as something that mattered, something that required attention, and I shifted slightly, just enough to gesture toward the screen behind me where the presentation had been paused, and with a simple nod, the slide changed, not to projections or growth charts, but to something far more precise, a structured diagram, ownership, governance, the framework that most people in the room knew existed but rarely saw laid out this clearly. And I did not need to explain every detail, I did not need to walk them through it step by step. Because the clarity of it spoke on its own, percentages, controlling interests, voting rights, all of it anchored to a single point that had just been spoken out loud but not yet fully processed, and I could feel the shift deepen, the quiet recalibration turning into something more defined, as pieces began to connect in ways they had not before, and I continued, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. Over the past several weeks, there have been discussions that assumed a certain transition was already decided. And I let my gaze move, not targeting anyone, but not avoiding them either. But assumptions are not decisions, and conversations are not authority. And that was when the room truly changed, not in volume, but in understanding, because now it was no longer about confusion, it was about realization, the kind that forces people to reassess everything they thought they knew about the situation unfolding in front of them. And I saw Ethan shift again, this time more noticeably, his posture no longer perfectly aligned with confidence, his focus narrowing in a way that suggested he was no longer looking at the room as a whole but at something specific, something he was trying to reconcile, and Olivia, for the first time, did not look composed, not fully. There was a pause in her expression, a hesitation that had not been there before, like she was searching for a version of this moment that made sense within the framework she had been operating in, and I did not address them directly, not yet, because this was not about confrontation, it was about structure, about letting the truth exist in a way that could not be reframed as emotion or misunderstanding. And I moved to the final piece, the one that did not require interpretation, as of this quarter, I said. All executive authority, including appointments, transitions, and approvals, falls under a structure that has already been finalized and legally recorded. And I let that settle, not adding anything to it, because the implication was already clear. The authority they believed they were stepping into was not available in the way they had assumed, not because it had been taken away, but because it had never been positioned where they thought it was, and the room responded. The only way it could, with silence that carried weight, the kind that signals not confusion anymore, but acceptance of a reality that cannot be easily adjusted, and I stepped back just slightly, not leaving the stage, but creating space for that realization to fully land, because this was the point where everything shifted from possibility to fact, and facts do not argue, they do not escalate, they simply exist. And in that existence, they change everything around them, and as I looked out across the room, I could see it happening, the quiet alignment of understanding, the recalibration of roles, the recognition that the narrative they had been following no longer applied, and then, for the first time since stepping forward, I let my gaze settle, briefly, on Olivia, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a kind of calm finality, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing what had always been true, just not acknowledged, and in that moment, surrounded by people who now saw the structure clearly, I knew there was nothing left to explain, only the outcome remained, and that outcome was already unfolding without needing another word from me. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it too long, and the first sounds that returned were not loud or dramatic, just small shifts, a glass set down a little too carefully, a chair adjusted half an inch, the quiet murmur of people recalibrating their understanding of everything they had just witnessed, and I stood there for a moment longer. Not because I needed to say more, but because leaving too quickly would have made it feel unfinished, and this was not unfinished, it was complete in a way that did not require explanation or reinforcement, and when I finally stepped back from the microphone, I did it without urgency, without looking for approval or reaction, just a simple step that marked the end of my part in the night, and the room responded accordingly, not with applause, not immediately, but with a shift in attention. A subtle realignment of where people directed their focus, and I could feel it move. Away from where it had been at the start of the evening, away from assumptions, away from expectations, towards something more grounded, something that no longer relied on interpretation. And as I stepped down from the stage, I did not look for Ethan, I did not need to, because whatever position he believed he was stepping into had already been redefined, not publicly challenged, not attacked. Just rendered inaccurate by the structure that now stood clearly in front of everyone, and that kind of correction does not require confrontation, it settles on its own, and I moved through the space with the same calm I had carried all night, past the clusters of people who now spoke in quieter tones, their conversations sharper, more deliberate, and I noticed how quickly the room adapted, how efficiently it adjusted to the new understanding, because that is what rooms like this do, they follow structure, not sentiment. And once the structure is clear, everything else falls into place around it. And then I saw Olivia, standing near the edge of where the crowd had begun to shift, no longer at the center, no longer aligned with the momentum of the night, and for a moment, she did not move, did not speak, just stood there as if the space around her had changed in a way she had not yet caught up to, and when her eyes finally found mine, there was no anger in them, not yet, no accusation, just something quieter, something more uncertain, like she was trying to locate the exact point where the version of the night she believed in had diverged from what actually happened, and I met her gaze the same way I had met everything else tonight. Steady, without urgency, without offering her anything. She could reshape into a different meaning, because this was not a conversation anymore, it was a conclusion, and conclusions do not need to be negotiated, and I did not walk toward her, did not close the distance, because there was nothing left in that space that required my presence, and after a second, she looked away first, not dramatically, not in defeat. Just in recognition that whatever alignment had existed between us earlier in the night no longer held, and that was enough, and I turned toward the exit, not hurried, not delayed, just moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had carried me through every step leading up to this moment, and as I passed through the lobby, the noise of the ballroom fading behind me, replaced by the softer hum of the city outside, I felt something settle that I had not noticed building until now, not relief exactly, not satisfaction in the way people usually describe it. Just a sense of clarity that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its natural end, and I stepped out onto the street, the night air cooler than I expected, the lights reflecting off the glass around me, and for a second, I paused, not to look back, not to reconsider, just to take in the quiet contrast between where I had been and where I was now, and it occurred to me then, almost as an afterthought, that she had been right in a way, just not the way she intended. Because I had not embarrassed her tonight, not publicly, not emotionally, not in any way that could be dismissed as reaction or impulse. I had simply let the truth stand where everyone could see it, and then I walked away, leaving the rest of the night to unfold without me, because some endings do not need to be watched to be understood.